President Obama getting ready for the State of the Union address. Our political power panel, they'll discuss what they expect to hear and what they want to hear from the president. Then Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders are in a virtual tie, not just in New Hampshire, but now Iowa. Is Bernie a real threat to Hillary, or is the media making too much of the Bernie surge? Also, confessions of a congressman. Steve Israel pulls no punches when he describes why he is leaving Congress. An inside look at the seedy underside of doing business in the nation's capital. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And we begin this evening with a State of the Union address. A little more than 24 hours from now, President Obama will be delivering his final State of the Union address, and this one will be different than all the others. In the past, he's been focused on the past, looking back at the accomplishments of the prior year. But tomorrow night, we expect the president to talk about his vision for the future and big picture things like America's role in the world and going forward, what he hopes America will look like. Let's bring in our panel to discuss the political implications of the president's move. Jeannie Zaino, professor of political science at Iona College and professor of campaign management at NYU. Jeannie. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, of course. Mike Morey, senior vice president of public relations at SKD Knickerbocker. And Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent, who will be in our nation's capital tomorrow night talking to legislators of both chambers. All right, guys. And Andrew, I'll start with you in terms of what you think we're going to hear. Already we're getting some of the outlines of it, if you will, and it seems to be as much of a political speech as it is one on big ideas. He seems to be, from what you hear at least, trying to make an argument as to who should succeed him and what Washington should kind of be in his aftermath.
Yeah, I think there's going to be very little in terms of policy specifics or even back-selling policies. You're not going to hear a lot, I think, about the president's numbers on healthcare reform or even the jobs created. I mean, you might get a few highlights, but he's not going to be back-selling the things that he's already done. It really does seem like a differentiating how the two parties govern and trying to make the case that a Democratic administration is the way to go forward. To me, the real challenge for the president, though, is going to be less about sort of doing that or laying out any particular policy positions, but just making himself heard above the echo. I mean, one of the things I'm expecting about tomorrow is that there's going to be very little focus on the speech itself or on the coming year. Everything in Washington is so wrapped up in the 2016 presidential and then, of course, the congressional elections. And it's going to be interesting to see if the president can even say anything that rises above the noise that's coming from the 2016 election.
You know, Mike, it was interesting. Over the weekend, I saw some job numbers for the last 2 years. Almost unprecedented in terms of rate of growth. I think there's a reason it was buried on 815 or whatever at the Times. It's like, nobody cares. No. Maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't. There's a debate about wages, but pure jobs, which has always been an indicator as to where we are, it's almost like, you know, so what?
The irony is that this president has made more jobs in the last 12 weeks than the last Republican president did in all 8 years. But you don't actually know that. And part of that is I think the president hasn't done a very good job. Part of that is the Republicans have unified in a way in opposition that I haven't seen an opposition party do in quite some time, because no matter what this man does, no matter what the indicators are, they still find sort of the dark lining of it. And so I think that's really hurt him in terms of the public understanding the successes of his administration. But I do think that what he will wind up doing tomorrow night is this is going to be the single last opportunity where he'll be able to command an audience of this size for the rest of his presidency. And so if I'm him, I talk about that. I talk about the fact that I now have 17 million people in the United States of America with access to health care, that I now have created more jobs in the last, has to be at least 3-4 decades, more jobs than any other president in the last 3 or 4 decades.
So you think he's doing a legacy speech?
I certainly would use it as an opportunity for legacy, but also to make sure legacy is connected to continuation of policy. Because I think what he should do is say, here's what we've got accomplished, and do you want to risk that? Do you want to risk the fact that in 12 weeks we've been able to create more jobs than the Republican president did in 8 years? Do you want to risk that we've put 17 more million people with closer access to health care? Do you want to take that away? Because the folks who want my job want to do that.
Jeannie, does he do that because it's an election year? It's a presidential one. That's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to lay the groundwork for your party to make inroads. Or is it just a resignation or a realization that nothing's going to happen in Washington this year? I mean, everybody's pretty much already said with how polarized Washington is, let alone that this is not just an election for president, but for Congress in many ways. No one's going to do anything. No one's going to stick their neck out. Is it as much about the calendar or just the reality there's not going to get anything done?
You know, I think this is a president who I was surprised in his 7th year had so many successes that have gone, some of them noticed and many of them unnoticed. And I think if he is going to talk about his legacy and if he's going to continue to try to push to make sure there is a quote-unquote third term of Obama in Hillary Clinton or in Bernie Sanders, he's got to do what Mike said, and he's got to tout those accomplishments in a way he hasn't been able to do. And I agree with Andrew, it's very hard to break through the noise. But if you look at the litany of things that this president has done, it is almost unprecedented in the modern era in a second term, the end of your administration, to have the accomplishments he had in his 7th year. There was a great piece, I think it was in the AP right at the end of last year, talking about how many things unnoticed that this president had done despite a recalcitrant Congress. So I think he is going to, he understands that Congress is not going to be with him, but that hasn't stopped him in the past. Look, he's taken action on guns most recently. He's taken action on immigration. He's done a lot of those things, and I think he does need to make that case to the American public.
If he goes on one subject there, Dominic, tomorrow, and if he sticks his neck out and says, "This is my last year in office, this is what I'd like to see done," is it domestic? Is it foreign policy? Where does he stick his neck out more than just saying, "Look what I did in 7 years"?
I think I shouldn't speak for the four of us, but I would imagine that he's going to talk very aggressively about guns. I mean, I think that's a no-brainer in terms of he's already indicated that. But what's clear, Richard, he's also going to talk about, and this is not putting his neck out there, but it's kind of odd for a president of the United States to talk about second chances in criminal justice reform as it relates to a State of the Union address. He is going to go there tomorrow night. And so what he's doing by the sheer definition of what he's doing in his last State of the Union address is he is saying he's not going to be a lame duck. Now, yes, it'll be hard to break through the noise, but as the President of the United States, when he speaks, people listen. And so I think he will break through.
Is there an opportunity with how fractured and divided and how I think the public has a perception that Washington, whether it's fair or not, they blame them all as children, that he can be the adult in the room in the last year and try and do that? Or is he going to be campaigner in chief?
You know, I don't think he's been very successful at doing that up until now, and I'm not sure, 10 months before a presidential election, you want to be the uniter in chief. I think you want a certain divisiveness in your politics because you need to establish the difference between our party and theirs, between what we want to do and what they want to do. I think he's going to continue on that path. I'm really not sure what he would even attempt to do to try to unite the country or unite the parties. It's just a little too fractured. And I actually think he can get above the noise by inserting himself into the race. If, that 2 or 3 days after the State of the Union, every candidate from both parties is getting questions about the president said this, what's your take on it? He might be able to alter the debate then.
Mike, I think it's really interesting. If you listen, and I know we will, when we listen carefully, do you think he's going to be sending messages to both Sanders and Hillary? Like if he talks about guns, Sanders, Yeah. If he talks about income inequality, that's more of a nod to Sanders. I think it was interesting the White House said that they had met privately with Sanders right now. It's not a complete love fest with him and Hillary. We knew that even privately, but even publicly. Are we going to learn a lot tomorrow, just how invested this White House will be in the Clinton camp?
It's interesting. So if I'm going to answer that, but let me just piggyback really quickly on what Andrew said about uniter-in-chief. I actually think had President Obama not tried to be the uniter-in-chief for the last 7 years, he probably would have gotten a lot more done, despite getting a lot done. And secondly, he probably would be in more command of sort of the narrative around his presidency, because I think that probably hung him up the most, was trying so bad to get over what is, in essence, our politics. But look, I think all the reporting suggests, and this stuff doesn't go reported without being checked. Look, it's very clear that the administration is behind Hillary Clinton. Whether they endorse her publicly or not is a whole other story, but I think it is very clear that the president is supporting her candidacy. I think the statement about guns, you should certainly read the tea leaves on his statement about guns and who we will and will not campaign for because of guns. Now, they've been clear that they won't actually endorse in the presidential election, but I think his statements on guns are indicative of what's important to him in this primary contest, and I think that Bernie Sanders on that issue has some challenges, and Hillary is certainly exploiting them, knowing that tomorrow night at the State of the Union address there will be an empty seat as a guest of the president representing victims of gun violence. So I think as you get into the home stretch of Iowa and you get into the home stretch of New Hampshire, Iowa, more importantly, I think the focus, Hillary turning back to Bernie Sanders' vote on giving the gun manufacturers essentially a blanket get-out-of-jail-free card for any responsibility for gun violence. I think that the president's speech, the empty seat, Hillary's decision to go after Bernie, I think you should read those tea leaves and understand where he stands on this election.
I know you always say, Dominic, you can't be the angry black man, but does he do the more scolding professor routine, or does he do Morning in America, look how much of a corner we've turned, better days ahead?
The latter. But the angry black man is coming. It's coming. Just wait until he leaves the White House. And I'm telling you, when he writes that book, no offense, folks, every black man in America could give you the same type of lecture or experience that the president.
We got a few months before that one, though.
Yes.
Jeannie, if there's one thing, usually we see a bump, right? About 3-5 points after a State of the Union, maybe less towards the end of administration, kind of a known commodity. Is that what the president's looking for, one way or the other? Well,
one issue is how many people actually tune in. And I have to say, I was watching today, and not as many news stations were covering the upcoming State of the Union as they usually do. And so my sense is that he might not get the audience he wants or the audience he deserves, and that would impact any bump. So, the focus has been so much on 2016, and I think, people will tune in, but I don't know if they'll tune in as great numbers to give him the kind of bump he usually
Jeannie,
gets.
they'll be here tomorrow night.
Well, they'll be
in
watching
droves.
RNN, of course.
Thank you. And speaking of tomorrow night, as you mentioned, Andrew will be live in Washington covering the address and talking to lawmakers and newsmakers. And, of course, we'll be live here. And we'll be opening up our phone lines immediately after the address. And I'll be joined by two former Congress people on both sides of the aisle getting their takes as well. Just 3 weeks before Iowa, and Bernie Sanders is pulled into a tie with Hillary Clinton. The two of them are also even in New Hampshire. Imagine if Sanders wins both. Does he become a legitimate threat? We'll discuss after this.